Today I want to talk about the lens that I thought would basically fix all my headaches for travel photography, the Sigma 20-200. On paper, this is basically the almost perfect travel lens, and it got the proper wide angle at 20mm and 200mm on the long end, and it's relatively compact. It's not insanely heavy, and you basically never have to change lenses again. And that's exactly why I bought it. I wanted this to be the centerpiece of my travel setup. The lens that just stays on the camera and does almost everything. And this is not going to be an in-depth review, and I also won't go through the spec sheets. Videos like this are on YouTube already plenty. This video is about my user experience after the last 10 months of using it, and most importantly, I will go into the reason why in the end I sold it. And the issue is not the 20-200 range, and it's quite the opposite. This focal range is incredible. It works incredibly well. But this lens has a list of compromises to achieve that, and I would say one deal-breaking flaw that in the end I sold the lens. But to achieve this focal range, there's like a range of compromises and, in my opinion, one deal-breaking flaw. And that over time made me question, did I really buy this lens for the right job? But before we get into this, let's take a step back. Before I had the Sigma, I had the 17-50 f4 from Tamron. And honestly, I loved this lens. I used it a lot for travel photography, and I also shot a lot of videos on my main YouTube channel with it. The f4 didn't bother me. The not really perfect image quality was also completely fine for what I want from a lens, but it only had one problem, the 50mm. As a one lens setup, 50mm is just a little bit limiting. For walking around the city on a day, that's fine, but if I go on like a bigger trip, I definitely want to have a longer reach than that. So when Sigma announced the 20-200, it basically sounded like the solution. I would lose a little bit at the wide end, sure, but in exchange I would get suddenly 4 times the reach. And instead of thinking about a standard zoom and a telephoto zoom, I could put one lens on my camera and basically leave it there. So I bought it, and for the next 10 months, this was actually what I did with the lens. I basically kept it on my Sony a7 II for most of the time. And I really used it in this period a lot. I have like 6,000 images in my Lightroom catalog that I edited. From that, more than half of them are shot on the Sigma 20-200. I took it to the Himalayas, through India's biggest cities, to the beach in Goa, and also to the desert of Rajasthan. Landscape, street photography, portraits, occasional wildlife, basically anything that we would call travel photography. And the focal range for that is genuinely fantastic. 20-200 in one relatively compact lens is really ridiculous. There was never a lens like this before. You can photograph landscapes, cityscapes, whatever at 20, and then something happens in the distance, like a bird appears or whatever, and seconds later you are at 200mm and capture that as well. And no lens change. You don't even have to think about bringing a telephoto because you basically have one built in all the time. You don't need to think about a second camera to have that ready. This is really something that, especially in the first couple of weeks using this lens, I enjoyed a lot about it. That flexibility definitely resulted in images that I wouldn't have captured before because I just wouldn't have the reach to do that. So the main promise of this lens absolutely works. But this focal range of 20-200, you have to pay a price for that, and you pay like in terms of a long list of compromises that I will get into now. And none of these following things are like issues that would have made me sell the lens completely. But they are definitely worth mentioning because they affected how much I enjoyed using this lens. First, let's talk about the weight. 540 grams is honestly very impressive for this type of focal range. You will not find a standalone telephoto lens to reach this lens at all, and then you have to carry another lens with it. But still, I used it on my Sony a7C II, which is filming me right now, and for that it has a quite small grip, and the combination just feels a little bit off balance and front heavy. So it's fine if you first hold it, but if you walk around like the whole day with it, you definitely notice it after some time. And then there's the zoom. The zoom, first of all, is different than for most other lenses. That's kind of weird. Sigma, I know, they always do it. And also the resistance is just a little bit too high. Is that a big deal? No, but it also is not an enjoyable experience if you have to torque the camera always to get through the zoom ranges, if that's specifically a lens that you buy for zooming throughout the focal range. I specifically remember the Sony 200-600 lens, which I had on rent, and this zoom throw is so quick and easy for this type of range that zooming in and out was really a joy. This is not the case with this lens. Then next topic, autofocus. It's also generally fine, not a big issue. On static subjects it's okay, but while tracking a subject and changing focal length, it can lose focus quite easily. And this is something where I just got used to my Sony cameras to basically keep on tracking focus all the time. So this kind of breaks the flow for me. It's not a disaster. It's not like this one lens that I want to have for critical autofocus performance, but it's again taking out a lot of the enjoyment or the confidence I had in this lens. And then there's the aperture. And I know I bought a slow travel zoom lens. Again, that's not the point. You go from 3.5 to 6.3 and that sounds totally reasonable. But you drop that 3.5 quite quickly. So basically at 20 millimeters, that's the only focal range where you have 3.5. And at 85, you're already at 6.3. So basically the whole telephoto range is at 6.3 in the aperture. Bright daylight, that's fine, but later in the day, especially indoors or in bad weather, the ISO goes up quickly. With a modern camera like the Sony a7C II, not a big deal again, but still you have more noise and more pictures that are in the range where you maybe want to apply denoising afterwards. If those would have been the only compromises, I think I would still own this lens. But then there was this one thing that was actually the deal breaker for me, and there where we have to talk about the optical quality. And generally, again, most of the parameters here are fine. The resolution is good enough for me. It has a lot of distortion, yes, but this can be corrected to software quite good. Then you have chromatic aberrations, basically non-existent. I have never seen those on this lens. Flare, sharpness, it's all fine, especially for what it is. But the vignetting is different. And normally I don't care for vignetting either. Most modern lenses rely on this also through Lightroom profiles to be corrected for. And normally you activate this profile and then the lens is fixed basically. But with the Sigma, that's actually not the full story. At 20 millimeters, when you stop down, the Lightroom profile can overcorrect for this vignette quite heavily. And all of a sudden you have brighter corners than the center of the image, and that makes it just look very unnatural and off-putting, I must say. And this is not something that I see in a laboratory test because I was pixel peeping. This is something that jumped into my face all the time when I was using this lens, and I kept using it quite wide open just to counter this anyway not bright aperture as much as possible. But then you see all of a sudden all your images look kind of weird already in the small thumbnail of Lightroom. And then you start correcting for it, and that's also not a big deal to correct for it. If you do, you move a slider, you move one slider and it's done. You just apply a little bit more of vignette and you can move on. And for one photograph, okay, that's fine. It's like a photograph that you really want to use, it's fine. But I don't edit just one photograph. When I come back from a trip, I sometimes come back with like 4,000 images of what I want to edit, like 700 images before I really make a selection of, okay, these are the 10 images that I want to post on Instagram or to my website or whatever. This is like the point where it becomes annoying, because then you start sorting for like, okay, these are the images that were shot with a Sigma at 20 millimeters at f8, and here I have to apply a different vignette for it to look continuously the same like the other images. And that's just like time spent for something, correcting that my lens was not good enough at that time. I would have much rather spent to work on the look of the image, to exceed this image more creatively and not fixing something technically. But then on the longer end, there's even a worse case for that. At the telephoto end, you get a very strange vignette in certain situations, especially where you have like kind of a flat image. You see it immediately. And this doesn't even look like normal vignetting. This looks like somebody accidentally added like a bad radial mask in Lightroom. The transition looks unnatural, and once you notice it, it completely dominates the image. And for me, I would basically consider these photos as unusable if I don't spend a lot of time correcting this. Stopping down to f8 definitely helps a lot, but at 200 millimeter, this lens is already at 6.3. And if my solution would be to always shoot this lens basically at f8 in this range, it's quite limiting for me to be my only telephoto lens. This is also then the area where this issue with this lens not was something that only happened in Lightroom, but was basically in the back of my mind while the whole time using this lens. Because once I knew about the vignetting, I was always like mindful of it. If I shoot something at 20 millimeters, I was already thinking, oh no, I have to check these corners later. At 200 millimeters, I'm like, oh, do I have to stop down to f8 for this vignette to be gone? And then do I still have enough light left basically to even get this shot? And that just affects the experience of using this lens and the experience of photography completely, if that's your only lens that you have, right? And then you go through the other points. The weight itself was okay. The zoom ring, I wouldn't sell it because of that as well, not for the autofocus or the aperture on paper. But this lens also didn't give me enough things back for me to be happily forgiving about these flaws. A good example is basically this Zeiss 55 lens. This is my only lens that I owned basically for all the time that I do photography now, over the last close to 10 years. And this lens is far from being perfect, not at all. There are many better, cheaper lenses on the market than this. And still, I don't want to sell this lens ever. I like how it renders, the look of it, how small it is. I like using it. So I happily forgive all its flaws, basically. But the Sigma was almost the opposite of that. Well, now I got the 70-300 from Tamron for the telephoto shots that actually matter. And then you use something like the 20-200, and it sometimes feels like I almost had too many choices, because then I was jumping through completely different perspective all the time, and my photography became kind of random. I didn't only change to a telephoto range when I was like, oh, this is a banging telephoto shot. I just took it anyways, and I have like a whole collection of kind of random images just to try something out, and I really stopped being focused on something that I want to achieve. I was just start doing random things basically. So after I was done editing this video, I thought, okay, maybe I look into my EXIF data a little bit and add to these feelings I had some actual stats that not necessarily back this, but for me to be more sure about my decisions, because statistics can tell you a lot of interesting things about many things, as well as your own photography. From what I've seen, in my last 3 trips, I used this lens for 88% of my keepers. means that yeah, this lens is a lens that I used by far the most of all of it. But that also, if you are coming from a different angle, that means that I used for roughly 90% of my photography the lens that I like the least, my worst lens that I own basically. And I think that is something that I got backwards. I got this lens as this do-it-all workhorse, as this lens as a centerpiece of my setup. But I don't think that the Sigma 22-200 is a centerpiece of basically anything. It's a specialized tool. It's a standalone thing because it really is the strongest if you go out with only one lens and one camera. And this is all that you can bring. Then on hiking expeditions, on snowy days, dusty days, whatever, not changing lenses at all can make the difference of having 200 millimeters or just don't have that available. And for me, I still took like over 20% of my images with like 100 millimeters or above on the Sigma lens. So I definitely use the telephoto end. Yeah, most of my images were still shot between 20 and 70. And great that Sony makes basically exactly that lens. So I think that is what I'm going to switch to. And then maybe add lighter telephoto lens to my travel setup, like the Tamron 70-300 would be for my use case the exact best solution, because my travel photography, even with the 22-200 lens from Sigma, was never like about, oh, I can only bring one lens. It sounds nice to only bring one lens, and on like longer hikes I would still enjoy it. But it's still possible for me mostly to change lenses or to bring another lens, to bring like a smaller prime lens for lower light, to bring a telephoto lens. It's possible. So I don't really fit the requirement of I need only one lens, and then the Sigma 22-200 is really not optimal for the setup anymore. If I can choose between the lens that I really want to use, that I really enjoy to use, which makes me more inspired or whatever to enjoy photography more, then I would definitely want to have a different lens than the Sigma 2-200. That's basically my takeaway from this, that I'm now much clearer about what I really need in a centerpiece of a setup, and I really tried to solve a problem. I don't change lenses anymore, and I have this dual-all lens with me. That was a problem that didn't really exist for me anyways. So let me know down in the comments what kind of zoom lenses you like to use, or if the 22-200 is the perfect lens for you. I don't know, everyone shoots differently, so I kind of find that interesting, and I hope my thoughts after 10 months using this lens was also something that was quite useful for you. And with that, I can only say thank you so much for the attention, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.